Bringing you the best music from home studios across the world. This is TAETRO Radio.
What's going on, everybody? This is TAETRO, and welcome back to an all-new episode of TAETRO Radio, the podcast where we showcase 4 home studio producers per week. If you're interested in getting your music on this podcast, shoot me a message over at facebook.com/TAETRO Music and say, I want in the TAETRO community. The TAETRO community is a closed Facebook group of home studio producers who all come together to help each other, give advice, and have different discussions about making music in a home studio. This week we have 4 awesome submissions, and we're going to kick things off right now with Dr. Punch and the Ancient Sensations. This one's called Ms. Is. Let's check it out. Alright, that was Ms. Is by Dr. Punch and the Ancient Sensations. Great track. Couple of notes about the producer. Dr. Punch is 20 years old from Massachusetts, which is over here in the US, and also my home state. Fun fact. This track had a really cool vibe to it. I really like the guitar. And when the track first started, I really didn't expect it to be this type of track. Like, it had a very synthy, almost 80s type feel in the intro. And then once the guitar and the beat and everything kicked in, I was like super excited because it wasn't what I was expecting. So props to that. Dr. Punch writes, the song started from me just jamming on my keyboard into clips in Ableton that I triggered from a Launchpad Mini. I laid down the drum track first and then added each instrument on top. After I felt I had enough loops and variations to work with, I laid out the clips on the timeline to arrange the track. On one of the lead instruments, I created 2 identical channels and panned each of them hard left or hard right and applied various different audio effect plugins to each. Then I decided to name the track after my girlfriend, Izzy, Aw, because the song was inspired by a couple of artists that she introduced me to and I drew the inspiration from. That's an awesome breakdown in terms of like workflow and like where the track came from. I know that that's usually how I work. Individual clips, different loops going, and you kind of build and build and build on top of that. And the hardest step that I think most people get hung up on is now bringing that over into arrangement view to get a finished track. I know I had a problem with that. I just had project files piling up and they were just session loops and no arrangement. So finally I started just taking things over into arrangement almost in the same session that I was creating them to force myself to have a finished track. And I can see that you've done that here, so really great job, and I think it's a really productive way to work. I hear some like Alt-J reference, especially with the guitar and the way everything's flowing, so that's really cool. I'm wondering if that was one of the influences. I really love your kick drum sound. It sounds nice and warm, and then also the stick sounds sound great, really organic. I really like your process of taking the sounds and panning them left and right to create that space in the middle. But I was a little confused as a listener at the beginning because I'm hearing almost like a beat repeat thing on one of the tracks but not the other, and it's kind of confusing me as a listener to where I should be listening, because obviously the guitar is in the lead there, but when it's happening in two different ways in the left and right, it just gets a little muddy and confusing, so I'd be careful of that. I think simplicity is always the best answer, and since the guitar is just entering there, it's new and it's surprising for the listener and it's interesting. So what the guitar is playing is great. We don't need to add that extra layer of effects happening in either ear to make it more interesting. Maybe somewhere down further in the track it would have made a little bit more sense, but since the guitar is new to us as a listener, then we can kind of keep it nice and simple. There are some really interesting choices with the synth about 3/4 of the way through the track. Some maybe like out of key notes, and I don't have a problem with that. I think the dissonance was really cool, and what you did was you doubled down on it, so that didn't just happen once, it happened multiple times, so it almost became thematic. And I do that a lot too when I'm soloing or something like that. If I play something that's a little off, I always play it again or at least 3 times. That way it becomes intentional. If you do something once and it sounds off, it's a mistake. If you do something multiple times in a row, it's intentional and the listener knows that you meant to do that. So props to that. One thing I would change though is I would have it be even more deliberate with your synth sound, because it's almost a little bit of a slow attack kind of synth sound, so the notes are kind of running into each other. I would have liked to hear the synth change a little there to be a little bit more hard, a little bit more in your face. That way we can even feel that deliberate nature even more. Overall, great track, great vibes. I really love the structure. I felt like I went somewhere from the beginning to the end of the piece. Great work by Dr. Punch and the Ancient Sensations. Thank you so much for your submission. This next track is by an artist called Gnarly Brown, and the track is called Build. Let's listen.
You're listening to TAETRO Radio.
Alright, that was Build by Gnarly Brown. Gnarly writes, I made this track starting with a single ambient chord on the OP1. As I let go of the chords, the sound totally changed to a more aggressive, punchy chord. That is basically the intro and leading into the song. I finished the song in a couple of days out of excitement and I'm pretty pleased with it. Gnarly also writes that he's looking for feedback, not just from me, but from viewers, so make sure you let him know what you think of the song in the comments below. This is a great example of how you can come up with a whole tune just based on one chord from one instrument, and it's probably something you would not have come up with had you not been playing on that specific piece of gear with that specific chord. So that's just a really special thing about how music is made and how the gear you're using can inspire the direction a piece goes. Word to the wise, if you're really excited about a track, don't go ahead and post it right away. Make sure it's everything that you want it to be. Because while you have a great set of sounds here and a really great idea, I think it's a little short and I think you could have probably expanded on it and had an even better track. Because these ideas are really great. That bass line is rockin'. Also, the drums sound really awesome, but I was waiting for the drums to come a little bit more forward. You know, that snare is sort of pushed back with the reverb, and I was thinking that the beat was going to pick up a bit and maybe have a little bit more of a drum and bass type feel, and we'd really start moving. But we kind of just stayed in that one little space, and for less than 2 minutes. So I think we could have added like a minute to this track and had a bit more evolution. Because the melodic ideas are there, the harmonic ideas are there. I will say though, most people have the problem of not exporting their tracks and just never finishing. So props to you for actually being like, okay, this track is done, I'm gonna put it out. Let's just take one more look at it and see if we can bring it to the next level. Like I said, I think the most obvious place for evolution in this track would be to bring the drums forward and actually create some kind of forward motion with them. So your snare and your shaker type sound are drenched in reverb, and that's really cool for the beginning of the track as they come in. I would bring them more to the forefront. Let's dial out some of that reverb and maybe change that kick drum groove a little bit more to be a little bit more busy and to just push us along a little bit more. I also would have really loved to hear that bass go from just playing root notes to maybe root and fifth or something that grooves a little bit more, because I think that's one of the strongest sounds in the track. Overall, I think you have a really great idea here and a really great beginning of a track. Everything from the synth sounds and especially the percussion sounds, those are all really great. Let's see if we can get to that next level of evolution and maybe get a 3-minute track out of this. Let me know what you think of this feedback and also feedback you'll get from the viewers, and if you decide to take some of that feedback and apply it to the piece, I would love to showcase the track again so we can sort of see the progression. Anyway, thanks so much for submitting Gnarly Brown, really great vibes. This next track is from a producer named Etienne, and the track is called 11th January 2017. Enjoy.
This is TAETRO Radio.
Alright, that was 11th January 2017 by producer Etienne, who is 19 and from France. He writes, I'm a student who is having 40 hours of math/physics class plus around 30 hours of personal work for the class per week. Add sleep time and there's barely no time for me to dive into music creation at the moment, but instead of a constraint, I took it as a goal. Do something pleasant in an hour max. And I think this is a really admirable goal that he has set for himself here, and we could all kind of take note because we all have different things happening in our lives. We all have different priorities. This seems to be super extreme. You know, education is really important and you're really diving into your class, but it's super admirable how you're still going and learning about creating music and diving into the music creation process with all that on your plate. We can all definitely take a note from that. This is definitely a great example of what can be done in an hour. Etienne writes, I'm using V Station that I got when I bought my Launch Key Mini with keyboard 3 and our Arpeggio 5 presets a bit tweaked. I'm using the same 1-bar pattern during the whole minute, and I'm using automation clip to enable/disable arpeggiator and change octaves during the music. So it's safe to say this is a minimalist effort through and through, and I think it's great. It's nice and simple. This is also a case where we can add a couple different elements and really take the track to the next level. And obviously what we're missing is drums. And I was hearing a real hip hop beat coming behind this, and I was really expecting it to come. So if we were going to add anything, that's what I would suggest that you add, is a backbeat to kind of drive this piece forward. It's also really interesting. I didn't find this piece repetitive, even though it is sort of looping, and you said you used the same material over and over. So good effort in tweaking different effects and then also playing with octaves so that it doesn't sound like just repeating of the same thing over and over again, even though that's what it really is. I think it's also important to note that Etienne points out that he did not start making electronic music until July 2016, so really only a few months. So all of us listening to this piece can really appreciate it for A, what you can create in the span of an hour, and also B, what you can create with only a few months of music creation experience. So Etienne, I will extend the same invitation to you. If you want to go ahead and add that backbeat or take this piece to the next level in your own way, resend it and I'll be happy to showcase the progress that you've made. Awesome submission, and thanks so much for sharing the vibes. This next track is by a producer called Bebraz, and the track is called Praise Zamorak. Let's check it out. Alright, that was Praise Zamorak by Bebraz. Bebraz writes, as a 100% nerd, I could not avoid combining fantasy tunes with drum and bass. As a result, I got a weird mixture, but in the end of the day, as long as music's reflecting the composer, it is done right, I assume. Plus, there's always a path to grow. Some advice would be greatly appreciated. So be sure if you have advice for Bebraz, leave it in the comments below. And I would just like to go on one point that you said, at the end of the day, as long as the music reflects the composer, it's done right. And you said you assume, but don't assume. I think that's a fact. Your influences are what make you you, and ultimately that's what's gonna make your music stand out. So if you're super into RuneScape and super into fantasy games and you want to include that in your music, there's going to be an audience for it, because you know what, there are millions of people who are into fantasy games like this and would love to listen to music like this. So definitely take whatever your influences are, as quote unquote nerdy as you think they might be, and run with them. This is a really high energy track, and which is why I kind of saved it for the end. Wanted to go out with a bang. And that drum and bass style really fits the set of sounds you have for your fantasy atmosphere here, and it's really great. One thing I think we talked about either on the last podcast or a couple podcasts ago about listener fatigue. And then that can especially happen in genres like drum and bass, where everything is so fast and so hard the whole way through. And if you listen to some hardcore music, what you'll notice is that 3/4 of the way through, or maybe 2/3, they'll end up having a breakdown, so a sort of half speed take on the same track. And what that does is that allows the listener to not only hear something different, but to also take a break, because a genre like drum and bass is so hard and so moving forward the whole time. We want to kind of let the listener relax for a second. So I would add maybe one section, that 3/4 of the way through, where it goes to half speed instead of being that double time drum and bass feel, to give the listener a break. And I think this would also help you better depict your fantasy atmosphere too, because in games you have fight scenes with a lot of action, but then you also have the lull in between where you're exploring the world. So if you kind of look at your track as you playing the game, allow that structure to also influence the piece. But I could see putting this on during a boss battle in a video game and feeling like really pumped to fight the boss. So great job with that. I really love the parts of this piece where it's a call and response. So you have one instrument playing a melody, but then another a little bit more aggressive synth comes in and almost answers it, and that kind of depicts this boss battle vibe you have going on here, where one instrument is the hero fighting the boss, the other instrument is the boss kind of cowering at the hero. Overall, great set of sounds. It really depicts a fantasy atmosphere, but also does a great job of blending that with drum and bass. So really awesome job there, and keep going with your quote unquote nerdy influence. I think it's going to make your music more original in the long run. Anyway, that's all we have for this week's podcast. I hope you enjoyed all 4 submissions. If you liked the submissions you heard today, be sure to leave a comment below and say which one you liked the most, and give these guys some feedback, because I'm sure they would appreciate it. If you'd like to have your music showcased on the TAETRO podcast, be sure to send me a message over at facebook.com/TAETRO music and let me know you want to be part of the TAETRO community, a closed group of home studio producers all giving each other advice and helping each other out as we create music independently. I release 2 new videos every week on youtube.com/TAETRO, and you can also find this podcast for free download on SoundCloud. Be sure to check all the links in the description below to show these artists some support. Shout out to Jerry, who is our voice of God on this podcast, and thank you all for listening. This has been TAETRO. Have a good one.
Homegrown music from the TAETRO community exclusively on TAETRO Radio.